Surviving the Survivor.
So, Carm, we're about to get details of a horrific crime out of Moscow, Idaho. But before we get there, there are some people in our audience who, how do I say this kindly, think that I don't treat you properly. Some I don't think realize that you're actually my mother. Not that that changes the dynamic, but I just want to say for posterity that I love you. You're the greatest mother ever, and I want the world to know this.
And you are the greatest son.
And let me tell you, unsolicited on the drive in here today, you said, I changed your life with this podcast because you're going through some difficult times.
It's true, but it's not about us. Let's go to Idaho.
Always about others, and you're correct. So without further ado, one thing that we always do right is bring in the top guests, and we are going to discuss the very untimely murder of Madison Mogen, 21, from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, Kaylee Goncalves, and I'll have Professor Smith helping with these pronunciations if I'm not pronouncing them correctly, and I apologize. She's also from Idaho. Xana Kernodle, 20, from Avondale, Arizona, and Ethan Chapin, 20, from Conway, Washington. This show is obviously about them. A horrific murder that happened back in the evening of November 12th and the 13th at the University of Idaho. Before we get into it, let me introduce our guest, and we are delivering in a big way this time. He is Professor Stephen Smith, a clinical associate professor emeritus at the University of Idaho in Moscow, which is where he taught for many years. He is a veteran news professional. He last served as editor of the Spokesman Review, the daily newspaper in Spokane, Washington. He had a 38-year professional career. He was editor of papers in Salem, Oregon, and Colorado Springs, Colorado, and taught media and society and media ethics at the University of Idaho. And there is no better guest because not only can he talk about what is happening, and he made it very clear, and we agree and understand and support him. He's not going to speculate about this, but can talk about what is going on, what is currently going on, as well as the media coverage of this and how that has been. So without further ado, Professor Smith, thank you for joining us. How are you?
My pleasure. Thank you.
Really appreciate you doing this. So, as you understand it, and I know you're not specifically covering the case, but where do we stand right now in terms of trying to figure out who did this? Because this has become a huge whodunit, right?
It's a big whodunit. The murders occurred sometime in the early morning hours of November 13th, so a week ago this last Sunday. Details from the police have been at best sketchy and at sometimes contradictory. At this point, with a press conference still scheduled for later today, another press conference from the local police. There are no suspects. They have not found the murder weapon, which is believed to be a large knife. They have ruled out a number of suspects whose faces or names emerged in the last week plus from video surveillance or community tips. They've ruled out the two roommates who were in the house at the time the murders occurred. But as far as we know in the public, the investigation has not produced any substantial leads, no persons of interest, no named suspects, potentially no suspects at all, which has left the community, not just Moscow, Idaho, but the communities of Pullman, Washington, where Washington State University is located, and even up here in Spokane, 80 miles away, the communities are very concerned.
So it's had an absolute ripple effect, as you just mentioned. No suspect in sight. Police, I believe, very recently said that they, obviously are still working on the case and have implied or implicitly stated that they're getting closer, but so far no sign of that. Obviously, I don't want this. Say that again.
I say no sign that they're close at this point. Nothing that we've seen from them that indicates they're close. Having covered and managed staffs reporting on these sorts of crimes in the past, I'm not surprised at their reluctance to be specific. That makes sense to me. They don't want to tip their hand. They don't want to let a suspect know they're on their trail. They don't want to compromise a potential arrest and trial. But nevertheless, it's been pretty sketchy.
It's not even clear who notified the police, right?
Yes, the police know who called. They have kept that information to themselves. There were 2 additional roommates in the house at the time of the killings. Speculation from the police and the coroner, not idle speculation, is that everybody in the house was asleep when the murders occurred, that the victims were killed in their beds. The 2 surviving roommates, according to the police, so again, this is what we know from the police, the 2 surviving roommates found one of their friends, they believed unconscious, and called other friends who came over. And it was somebody in that group of other friends who apparently called 911. About noon on Sunday, the murders occurred early in the morning hours, sometime after 2:30, 3 o'clock. It was noon the following day when the friends of the friends called 911. They've all been ruled out as suspects, so no one involved in that 911 call is suspected of the crime. But the lack of information on who placed the call, how the call sounded, what was said, this notion that a victim was unconscious after being butchered by a knife, none of that's been explained by the authorities.
And what is strange, we saw they show the structure, the building from the outside, and then they said the 2 roommates who were not killed were in the basement. But the whole building is really small, and if they are knifing to death 4 people, won't somebody shout?
That's an excellent point, Carm. Just very quickly, if you check out the thumbnail, if you're watching this on YouTube and not the audio platforms, you can see a photo of the house. It is an oddly shaped house, right, Professor Smith? Can you just kind of explain the layout of the home where this happened? And to Carmela's point, how would 2 roommates in there not hear the other 4 getting bludgeoned to death?
Well, that last question of yours is fundamental to the speculation. This has sparked social media speculation, community rumors from the get-go. People from all over the world have posited various theories. I have no idea. I believe the police probably do. I had an apartment after my wife took a job up here in Spokane. I took an apartment so that I could not have to commute every day to the University of Idaho. And my apartment was right around the corner from this area, this neighborhood. Typical close to campus student housing, older housing stock, not always in the best of condition. The kind of place where you need 5, 6, 7 people living there to be able to afford it if you're a student. So none of that is particularly unusual. I have no idea, have not seen a schematic of how the house was structured. Only what the police have said is that there were 3 levels on which these various people, victims and roommates, were sleeping. Moscow is prototypical sleepy college town. The university is 125 years old, one of the oldest in this region. It's got all of the elements of an Ivy covered campus with new buildings, new facilities, but very older looking campus, best known for a 1904 visit from Teddy Roosevelt. The university is not particularly large by contemporary standards, about 12,000 undergraduates. The town itself is typical isolated college town, about 20,000 people, not counting the student community. In the summer, it's pretty emptied out. There's a little downtown retail district, which is kind of classic small town college. it is isolated. If you understand the layout of the Northwest, Moscow, and by the way, we call it Moscow because during the Cold War, residents were very careful to not say Moscow. So it's Moscow, Idaho.
I realize I mispronounced that off the top, so my apologies to everyone in Moscow.
No, everybody does. Because everybody does. It was established, the city was established by Russian farmers. It's a huge wheat growing region. It's the Palouse, which is the region in which Moscow and Pullman are located, is one of the most significant wheat growing regions in the world, founded by Russian wheat farmers. In any event, it's a quiet community. It's a blue bubble in a incredibly red state. So the politics of Moscow itself tend to be quite liberal. There is a significant, I wouldn't even call it evangelical. There is a church community which in the last several years has taken on sort of a cult status and has attempted politically to kind of take over the community, and they've been thwarted at the polls multiple times. So there's that sort of division, but it is clearly a college town. But it's important geographically to understand that Washington State University, which is about twice as large, in Pullman, Washington, is only 8 miles away. We're both right on the state line. And so Washington State University, about twice as many students. What happens in Moscow affects Pullman. What happens in Pullman affects Moscow. The university itself is a state ag college. It's a land grant institution. It's best known regionally for its ag sciences and natural resources work, but it has a sizable college of letters and social service sciences and arts, which is where I taught. About half of the undergraduates are first-time college students. They come from all over the region, but especially small-town Idaho. And the University of Idaho is basically their ticket to a future. So my experience was these students work their tails off. But it is isolated, and there's nothing much to do in Moscow on weekend nights. So students who are of age hit a couple of the college bars downtown, and the Greek life, fraternity and sorority life is hugely significant, both in Moscow and Pullman.
And I believe 2 of the students, we'll get to this in a moment, were coming back from fraternity parties. Carmela, you care to...
That would be absolutely typical.
Yeah. Carmela, do you care to take a guess at the last time there was a homicide in Moscow, Idaho?
7 years ago.
You did your homework, Carm. So impressed.
They accused me of not doing my homework the other day.
I have such a deep love and gratitude for the work that you have done.
Now he's doing it because they criticize him that he's harsh to me.
Yes.
I'm translating for you our behavior.
So one of the interesting things, and then I want to get into some of the meat and potatoes of the actual case and where we are, but you mentioned this, you alluded to this off the top. Pullman is right next door with a massive university. Obviously, University of Idaho is in Moscow. A lot of students, since this happened pre-Thanksgiving, took off, and professors are saying you don't necessarily have to come back. Do you have any idea of, percentage-wise, how many students are choosing at both the University of Washington and here to not return to classes?
That's a good question. I don't have any specific numbers. I'll tell you this. Within 24 hours of the murders, students and some faculty members, by the way, began to leave the community to go home. It was just a week away from Thanksgiving break. There was enormous concern in the community right away. By Tuesday, Wednesday, the university was essentially a ghost town. Students had gone and some faculty had gone. The university made clear fairly early on, not as quickly as I would have liked, but early on, that they would be flexible with students and ask professors to be flexible with students and to not hold them to significant deadlines, that sort of thing. Usually the week before Thanksgiving is the last productive week of the semester, and there are a lot of tests and kind of heavy duty project work is due, and students were given flexibility on that. And they've been told now that they don't have to come back to campus for the last 2 weeks of the semester. The university will make sure that there are distance learning alternatives available to all students, which of course we're quite familiar with, given what occurred during the.
Carmen,
if I was still at Brandeis University and there was a savage quadruple
Wait
murder,
a minute,
I'm asking a question.
Wait a minute.
Let?
It's not because of the savage murder. It's because the killer is at large.
Yes, but would you? I'm asking you, as you're the mother here. Would you let me go back to campus?
I would send you back to college.
Would you?
No, I'm kidding.
No, would you?
No, of course I wouldn't.
My father, who's struggling in the hospital and hoping he pulls out of it, he would have sent me back. He would have said, you'll be fine, right?
No, but you don't know how crazy people can be really crazy, and it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
The day I worked at the World Trade Center, the day the towers fell, and my father and you said come home. My father said go to work. I said, how do I go to work? There's no building. He said try to get in there. That was the advice my father gave me. Horrible advice. Anyway.
After he told you go play in the road.
This is one of the most heinous crimes, so apologies, but Carmela survived the Holocaust with a little black humor, and it's you got to have, despite all the horrors, you still have to find a way to enjoy life moving forward. But with that said,
not if you are the family.
No, not at all. I mean, I have some quotes from the mother, one of the victims, which I want to get to as well. But this first. So the Moscow police captain, a gentleman named James Fry, Captain Fry, he came out publicly and said, based on details at the scene, we believe that this was an isolated, targeted attack on our victims. We do not have a suspect at this time, and that individual is still out there. We cannot say that there is no threat to the community, and as we have stated, please stay vigilant, report any suspicious activity, and be aware of your surroundings at all times. Now, initially, and correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Smith, they said everyone was safe. There was no reason to be worried, and then kind of backtracked. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons the impact on students and faculty was so substantial, and why the exodus to home occurred as it did. For 3 days, the police held close to this line that it was a targeted attack, and that even though they had no suspect, there was no threat to the community. Then on the Wednesday following the murders, the chief, as you just noted, says, sorry about that. He or she is still at large, and we cannot say there is no threat. I think if they had been more upfront about that from the beginning, the impact might have been maybe more manageable. But when you're dealing with something like this in a community like Moscow, to not be forthcoming on that public safety issue caused more harm than maybe they anticipated.
By the way, was there a break-in? Was there a break-in, or it was were the doors broken down, or the window open, or?
We don't know. We don't
know.
I thought it was reported. I thought it was reported that there was no forcible entry, but you're saying we don't know if there was forcible entry at this point?
There was no sign of forcible entry, but we don't know if the doors were unlocked, if somebody had a key. These are kind of ticky-tacky student housing situations, and so the security was probably not significant one way or the other.
Do we know if anything was stolen from the home? Anything was taken? Was it a robbery potentially?
Nobody has said anything about that. Nothing from the police has suggested that.
Carmela.
No, I have a question. If it's targeted killing, I know out of the 4, 3 were women, 1 was a man. And I know that the young man and the young woman, they were a couple. They were dating. And then there was another twosome that were childhood friends, correct?
That's my understanding.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm thinking, if it's a targeted killing, how do these 4 become all 4 targeted? They seem to be 2 distinct groups, two distinct...
Carm, you led right into where I wanted to head. So let me lay this out, and then we'll get to it with the professor, excuse me. So there are few clues, very few clues to underscore that in this case. And I want, Steve, coming up, I want to get your take on why this has become, the most high-profile murder case in the country without question right now. And I think the answer is sort of obvious, but I want to get your take in a moment. Before that, let's just lay out what happened. And I've got kind of a timeline here. In the hours before their murder, Madison Mogen, who's 21, and Kaylee Goncalves were at a downtown Moscow bar called the Corner Club between 10 p.m. and 1:30. You familiar with the Corner Club, Steve?
Oh, yes.
What kind of bar is it?
It's a classic college town student bar. It's relatively secure. They don't have a reputation for serving underage, but it is on weekend nights. It's massively crowded. They do a pretty good job, maybe not as good as parents would like, of making sure that there's not an enormous amount of over drinking. And when the bar closes, students spill out into the streets, and there are usually a couple of food trucks nearby that serve the kind of greasy food that students need after a night of partying.
And sorry to interrupt. Yeah, Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it just reminds me so much. We grew up a stone's throw away from Rutgers University, and we used to go to fraternity parties in high school, Mom. I did not go to Rutgers, and Rutgers, same thing, was super famous for their greasy food trucks. We'd all go, and that was a little different time and era, being that I'm 53, but it reminds me so much, and it's hard to imagine this happening at any university, let alone University of Idaho, but, being that Rutgers is so close to home, it makes you think how it would play out. And obviously, in Highland Park, there would be a lot.
I did not know that in high school you were going to fraternity parties.
All the time.
I have to find it out on a podcast.
Beer bongs and the whole thing. So
after
Others
they leave,
never know.
Mothers never know. So after the Corner Club, they then visit, as the professor just alluded to, a late night food truck. There's a video of the two friends. This is Mogen and Goncalves. A video of the two of them. They attended high school together, and they both worked at a local Greek restaurant. It shows them ordering pasta at this food truck with no signs of any kind of distress. They're laughing. I've seen the video. They're talking to people. Now, at approximately 1:40 in the morning, leading into Sunday morning, they get a ride home from what's only been described as a private party, a person detectives have investigated and currently do not suspect had anything to do with the pair's homicide. Steve, I assume you don't know anything more about this private party, but police obviously like to keep things close to the vest, so when they get a suspect, they can interrogate, find out what they know and what they don't know, and know if perhaps it's their person of interest. So, but they are being quite obtuse, if that is the correct word, right? They're not being forthcoming.
Yes, and I think it's important to keep in mind, this is a community of 20,000 people. I don't know how many officers are on the force, but it's not a lot. After the first couple of days, this crime is of such magnitude that they brought in, or they were asked to bring in, both the FBI and the Idaho State Police. And I will speculate on this point, which I'm relatively comfortable based on my experience covering crimes of this sort. A good reason to bring in both of those agencies, not just for field work, but for the forensic work. The Idaho State Police runs the forensics lab in the state. The FBI has forensic resources. I'm assuming that they were FBI resources out of Spokane, here where a regional office is located. And they've helped with the investigation, and they're now also helping with the communication. And again, this is speculation, but it's media speculation, so I'm comfortable. The contradictory statements from the local police turned around and became somewhat more accurate and honest after communications help from the Idaho State Police arrived. So I think that Wednesday press conference where it was made clear the suspect was still at large and that there was a potential threat, in my mind, that's probably coming from the advice of higher up authorities who have more experience in handling this sort of thing. If I can just say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, you don't have to go far back in time to see how it's difficult for some smaller jurisdictions to handle this kind of high-profile case. Look what happened in Uvalde, Texas. You know, that was just the mass shooting at the school there was an absolute disaster on so many levels. But obviously, oftentimes during a high-profile case like this, the state authorities and then the federal law enforcement officials come in, and that's exactly what's going on. I did not mean to cut you off, so continue your thought.
I was just going to mention the previous two murders in my time at the University of Idaho were substantially different, and so didn't stress out the police force quite this way. In 2014, there was a shooting in the community, did not involve students as victims. It was a disgruntled, mentally ill individual who shot his adopted mother, shot an employee at Arby's, shot his landlord. But that was resolved fairly quickly. The police knew who they were looking for. They found him and he was arrested. In 2011, a student at the University of Idaho, graduate student named Katie Benoit, was shot during a backyard barbecue by her former professor, who was also her former lover and a stalker who'd been fired from the university. And it was clear immediately who had committed the crime. It took a couple of days to find him. He killed himself in a hotel room. So in those cases, the crimes are high profile, but there's none of this gray cloud of speculation and lack of information around it. And so the impact on the community is far less. And on the police.
Yeah, I want to circle back. So we talked about the two who left the corner club, and the two young ladies left the corner club. Women, not ladies. I don't want to get yelled at. It's politically incorrect, Harm, to say ladies anymore. So they leave the bar. They go home. That's their story. Then there's another pair that ends up being murdered as well, and that's Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle. They were at a party at Sigma Chi. That's a fraternity house on campus. They were there until about 1:45 in the morning. They returned to the King Road house, which is where their home is. Ethan Chapin, and his mother spoke out, and I'll get to her in a few moments. He did not live at the house, but was staying over the night. All of them were members of the University of Idaho, either a sorority or a fraternity. As Carmela mentioned, the bodies are then found on the second and third floors of the house. The two other roommates who lived with them were home asleep by 1 a.m. Now, Carm, you brought it to our attention. You read that they were asleep in the basement. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I read. I don't know.
Do you know if that's correct, Professor? It was my understanding they were in a different portion of the house, but I don't know if they were in the basement necessarily.
I can't tell you basement or not. I do know that there were multiple floors and that the two survivors were on a different floor from where the murders have occurred.
So it gets a little more interesting. A 911 call didn't come in, and keep in mind, these murders happened, police believe, between 3 and 4 in the morning. So the 911 call doesn't come in until 11:58. That's almost noon on Sunday. That's 10 hours after the victims returned home and 7 to 8 hours after police believed they were killed. The call allegedly came from one of the surviving roommates' cell phones. Now, Steve, if I heard you correctly, are we still certain that that's the case, or we don't know for sure that it came from a roommate?
Police have said it came from one of the roommates' cell phones, but the call was apparently made by one of that person's friends. The first call that the roommates made was not to the police, it was to their friends. Who those friends are, their relationship to the folks in the house has not been made public by the police. Apparently, the friends called their friends that there was a problem, that they couldn't wake up one of their roommates. The friends came over, and the police said that one of those friends who arrived later then, made the 911 call about noon. That's what we know.
What about the weapon?
The weapon, what do we know about the weapon other than it was a knife, they believe, correct?
Yeah, the police have said that it was a large knife. The coroner said it was a large knife, multiple stab wounds on each victim, and that was the cause of death. One of the things the police have been doing, they've been contacting area hardware stores and department stores and other kind of hunting and fishing stores to see who's been purchasing large knives of late. This part of the country, and those of you on the East Coast may not have a complete understanding of the geography and the landscape. This is hunting and fishing capital of the Northwest. Trying to find a large knife in this community would be extraordinarily difficult, but that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah, that's like finding I guess a needle in a haystack. Professor, you mentioned 2 other murders, a bunch of years back, but you've covered crime in this region for a very long time. Anything come close to this in terms of the high-profile nature?
Oh, Spokane and Coeur d'Alene, which are basically sister cities across between the eastern Washington and western Idaho borders. It's a metro area of a little over 500,000 people. So we have crime, and we've had some bizarre murder cases, hits for hire, domestics that have gone wrong, spouses who have tried to kill their mates and covered it up. This crime is of a different level, and I think it gets to the point you were making about it being a national story. There are so many elements of this that are beyond the norm. And so it's a huge story here in Spokane, where a lot of students are from. It's dominating the news in Moscow and Pullman and elsewhere in the Northwest.
Here's what's mystifying to me. You have 4 people, assuming they're asleep, you get bludgeoned to death, and the 3 others have got to hear the screams and wake up. But Carm.
Well, I just had an idea.
Well, I was going to ask you your opinion because
I'll call the FBI. Get me a number.
Well, when you wake up out of a sleep, you're obviously disoriented. But it's just, to stab to death 4 people.
Wait a second. It's not excluded that something was in their drinks.
Very good, Carm. That's possible. And you know what's interesting about Carm's comment is the following. The latest news that we have on this is an FBI profiler has come out and basically said that they believe, this FBI profiler, and I'm looking for the name here because I'm doing this in real time. His name is Jim Clemente. He's a former FBI profiler. He spoke to Fox News, and he says he believes the culprit here, the murderer, was either a stalker or somebody known to the victims. He profiled the killer as sloppy and close in age to the victims. The offender, he says, did not just randomly choose this location, that he targeted 1 or more people in there. That could be that he targeted this area, this home, because he has a relationship with 1 or more of them, or it could be that he's been stalking 1 or more of them. Before we get to the professor, Carm, what do you think of that? And that's actually an interesting point. Maybe they were drugged if he was stalking them. Carm?
No, but in my mind, and believe me, I am not even an amateur. I'm just a nobody. But I cannot imagine in that building that I saw pictures of that 4 people are stabbed and 2 others are sleeping through it. Mm-hmm. It's impossible unless they were somehow
incapacitated.
not making noise.
Right.
They were not making noise.
There is one piece of information that the police have released and the coroner released that may illuminate a bit of this. One of the victims, and it apparently was Chapin's girlfriend, had defensive wounds, or what the coroner said looked like defensive wounds. Her parents in Arizona said that she was a fighter and that it did not surprise them at all that she might have tried to defend herself. So that's what we know. The rest is pure speculation. And with all due respect to a former FBI profiler, he's not here. He doesn't know. The FBI is not telling him what they know. And that's the kind of speculation that, as a person who taught media ethics and who is not a fan of the cable news talk fests that travel in this sort of misinformation, this drives me crazy. He might be right. He could be 100% wrong. But that sort of information confuses the public. It can lead to wild rumors and social media speculation that does more harm than good. And frankly, I wish he'd shut up.
Carm, we need a professor to keep us in line. And
No,
I'm
but
glad. And this is why Steve Smith is the best guest.
We need more ethics professors.
We do.
We all speculate all the time, but it gets out of hand on the internet.
And what I want to say here
gets
too, Carm, is that it becomes it's akin to politics in this sense. Is that true crime becomes theater, and you forget that there are 4 college kids who are actual
20 and
21 who are actual victims here, and it sounds cliche, but our hearts go
By
out
the way,
to the families. Now, yes, Carm.
When is this conference? The
This
next
conference,
one?
I haven't heard the exact time. They've been holding them at 3 o'clock Pacific time. There is no indication at all, no indication at all that there's going to be any substantial announcement. It's going to be just another update.
So there was some information police released that's kind of interesting. They announced that detectives were made aware of multiple phone calls from both Mogen and Goncalves, who were the ones at the food truck. Those were made to a male. That man remains unidentified by police and has been ruled out as a potential suspect. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Professor, but I believe that person turned out to be a former boyfriend or current boyfriend of one of the victims, and even the family came out and said there's no way this guy was involved. Do you know anything more about this?
No, you have it right. That essentially what the police have said is that there were multiple calls in the 2 o'clock, 2:30 range that morning to an individual who did not answer the calls. The police have said that this individual has been thoroughly investigated and is not a suspect. The families said that it was a former boyfriend, that he was a childhood friend of one of the victims, that they had dated for about a year and had split amicably, and they actually expected them to get back together. So there's absolutely no indication from any source that he is a suspect. And that's, if I could backtrack just a bit, in those first few days of confusion, the mayor of Moscow, inappropriately and without knowledge of what the investigation was saying or was finding, told the press, told the New York Times, that it was a crime of passion. That statement, plus the statement from police that it was targeted, led to this social media frenzy that it had to be a boyfriend or a stalker or something along those lines. The mayor made that statement unwisely and tried to walk it back, but you can't walk something like that back in this environment. And so much of the speculation, the rumor, the frenzy has focused on this perception that it might be passion, love, sexual motivation, without any evidence to back it up or support it at this point. But in any event, the ex-boyfriend has been ruled out as a suspect.
And now back to some facts here. So the county coroner, the autopsy report showed, according to the coroner, no signs of sexual assault. The coroner whose name, her name is Kathy Mabut, if I'm saying that correctly, says there was a lot of blood. She said this to the Spokane, Washington Station Creme last Tuesday, calls it a very sad scene, and concluded the 4 victims were probably asleep when they were stabbed multiple times, and some of them had defensive wounds. Carm, the more I think about this, and the professor is going to get upset with me because this is speculation.
Let's not speculate with the, Professor Smith.
Maybe
It's
you're right.
Unethical.
Now, neighbors said that they would often see people in the windows almost every night of the week, probably 4 or 5 nights a week. There are a lot of people that went in and out of that house pretty frequently. I mean, Professor, if it was a stalker or a student, and again, I am not a law enforcement officer, but I mean, it's not that big a university and students all know each other. I mean, to me, it seems like that would be somewhat, more easily solvable in terms of solving this case. But I mean, we're more than 10 days out, and it's a complete mystery right now. I mean, what do you make of it without speculation? I mean, why is it so confusing to the law enforcement authorities?
One of the things that I will say, and this is a college, this is a university, a small town university. People coming and going, large groups of people, impromptu parties, all hours of the day or night, especially into the weekend. This is life as usual. To look at this house and suggest that the goings and comings could have included a killer, maybe not. That's just the way campus life is, not just at the University of Idaho, but every university with which I've ever been associated. Students live lives completely different from the lives that you and I might remember. My children are out of college, thankfully, but I remember their lives in college, and there's nothing different about their lives than the lives of the students at the University of Idaho. Why are the police confused? What aspects of this case are causing them difficulty? I can say as an observer that the lack of a murder weapon is probably the most significant thing we know about the investigation. You know that forensically, having a murder weapon gives you the kind of information that can lead to a relatively quick solution, and they don't have the murder weapon. They aren't even sure exactly what kind of a knife it was. So that to me is the first indication, or the first detail that explains why this case remains unsolved.
And that's so critical to, once they find this person, which they will, or people, a murder weapon is very critical to the prosecution, Carmela, as you well know. Now, to the media aspect of this, first off, let me start with this. So Stacy Chapin is the mother of Ethan Chapin, and Stacy Chapin, our hearts go out to you, they really do. Described her son as one of the most incredible people you will ever know, which, Carm, I hope you would say of me. We've had discussions about this recently, Carmela. She went on to say, they got stabbed, we got the call, and this is to the professor's point. This is what Stacy Chapin says. I don't want people to make assumptions about our kids. It wasn't drugs, and it was definitely not some passion thing between these kids. Someone entered the house, Stacy Chapin told the Idaho Statesman 4 days after her son's body was discovered. So she's kind of making the same plea as you are, Professor, to not make assumptions.
Speculate.
Because when you assume, we know what the saying, how that saying goes. And right now, there's not a lot to go on. I mean, that's what I think is so perplexing to so many people. And the reason this is becoming more and more high profile is there is a dearth of clues, right?
That's absolutely true. You've got a butchering of 4 young people whose entire lives are ahead of them. Smart young people. These were not ne'er-do-well students, smart young people. A horrific crime, and 10 days out, as you noted, there's no answer. People are terrified, they're confused, and in our current environment, the speculation, the social media, particularly the rumors, and frankly, the unethical performance of news organizations, mostly outside our region, causes enormous confusion in the community and enormous pain to the families of the victims, particularly Chapin's family, because this notion of crime of passion bounced back on him initially in ways that are just horrible and sad. As a parent myself, I don't know what my reaction would be if my child had been dragged through the mud that way.
And Carm, I can tell you from firsthand experience, the local news stations, the local papers tend to cover this with a sense of decency, probably with more journalistic integrity. Finding that as well, that the national outlets are being a little more irresponsible than the local stations and newspapers?
Yes and no. Let me try to explain. Locally, you're absolutely right. The local media have handled this with more discretion. Having said that, given the state of local press everywhere, but even in our region, the lack of sizable news staffs, the turnover in editors, the relative youth and inexperience of important reporters. What we had in those first few days of coverage was what I call press release coverage. Reporters were essentially just repeating what the police were saying in their press releases. As an editor, former editor of a local news staff, I have to think that given the public safety issue involved, I would have told my reporters to go balls to the wall to challenge the police on their statement that there was no threat. That's changed. There's a little more aggressiveness now, particularly out of the news staff at the Spokesman Review here in Spokane, which is the largest news staff in the region. Local press has done as well as it could given the circumstances, including the two college papers, the Argonaut at UI and the Daily Evergreen at Washington State. Nationally, there's been some very responsible coverage if you monitor the print coverage. The New York Times, which has a strong regional reporter in Seattle, has done an excellent job focusing on the facts. My concern has been with a couple of national organizations that have tried to insert themselves in ways that are just incredibly unethical. Trying to bribe student journalists, for example, with big paychecks to crash private funerals and act as students when in fact they would be reporting for these national organizations. That is ethically absolutely indefensible. And I am, as you can tell, I am not a fan at all of the cable talk fests, which exist primarily to give voice to outside sources who speculate endlessly to fill time. To me, that is also ethically indefensible. So two issues, maybe not as aggressive locally as they needed to be up front, lack of ethical standing on the part of some national organizations.
And I'm glad that Professor Smith is calling people out for this, because it would make Edward R. Murrow
Happy.
twirl. No, it would make him twirl in his grave.
No,
guy.
but would be happy with
happy
Professor.
with the professor. By the way, now if you ask my 8, 6, and 3-year-olds, they will say good night and good luck to you, Professor Smith, because I've taught them all about Edward R. Murrow. When you said your kids were out of college, I immediately had a heart palpitation, realizing I have 3 to send to college, and I'm not that much younger than you. So I have a big hill to climb. I'm sorry, go ahead.
The School of Journalism and Broadcasting at Washington State University is the Murrow School, named after Edward R. Murrow, who went to college at Washington State when it was Washington State College back in the day, before World War II. If I could take this opportunity, let me note 2 local reporters who I think have just done terrific work in this. One is Emma Epperly. She's a young reporter at the Spokesman Review, and she's been their lead reporter pretty much since the beginning, maybe not right away. She's done excellent work. The other is a TV reporter, John Paul Webb. Interestingly enough, John was a former student of mine at the University of Idaho just a few years ago. He's a young reporter, young guy. built for TV. And they dispatched him to UI early on, and he's just done great work because he knows the school and he knows the students and he knows the faculty. He's been great. So I wanted to mention their two names. I would not be here to talk about this case at all absent the good work of those two reporters and others who've done a pretty good job locally.
See, the professor keeps getting better and better because he's calling people out for doing the wrong thing, but calling out reporters who are doing a good job. So it's always nice to hear that.
Can I say one other thing very quickly?
You can say as much as you want.
Only peripherally related, because I'm a proud parent. My daughter, Liz, is in Colorado Springs. She is a spokesman for the gay community in Colorado Springs. She's got a very high profile in the community and was often a patron at Club Q. She was not there Saturday night in the shooting at Club Q, but she has been handling press relations for the gay community since it happened. So this last 10 days has really brought home the effects of violence on those of us who tend to try to delude ourselves into thinking that it can't happen here or to us or to people we love. And this would be my question to Carmela as a therapist. Students at the University of Idaho have been traumatized for the last few years by COVID. Mental health issues, even while I was teaching, my office was a safe space. And several times a semester, I would have to walk students across the street to the counseling center, often for suicide intervention. And the psychological impact of this on top of all of that pre-existing trauma, what do we make of that, Carmela, and how do we help?
Well, I think that they sent they stopped the teaching early and sent people home, but I don't know if that's the best solution either, because they are not dealing with it. They just move away from it, and the trauma is still unresolved for them. They are still dealing with it, but now they don't have the support of the group that went through the same thing with them. They are isolated in their own homes. And we know that young people are very more sensitive and more emotionally not prepared for these shocks, because this is maybe one of the first ones in their lives. And they're vulnerable. So I think the parents really need to do things to give them the right support and not take it for granted if they are, seeming for observers, they seem like they are not there mentally. It doesn't mean that under the surface, some issues are not making them more vulnerable, and that the issues are not brewing. And I don't say each of them will become like suicidal, but there is a danger of already, if they had a tendency to depression, that this pushes them even further. So I think the parents should be aware, even if their children came home and they're away from what they perceived as the major threat of an attack, they're still, even at home, they're vulnerable.
Yeah, I can just imagine at home, parents thinking they're doing the right thing. Let's not talk about this. It's going to be okay. Enjoy your Thanksgiving dinner.
Keep it under the rug.
Yes. And as a parent, I can understand that notion. As I left the university when I retired a couple of years ago, the mental health crisis on campus had reached such a level that the counseling center could no longer keep up with it. COVID made it worse. And my guess is, and you probably would agree, that when students start coming back, if not right away in the January for the winter semester, they're going to have to deal with this.
I mean, there's so many things.
The emotional stress is dormant, but then some totally unpredicted event will reawaken that crisis mode.
Not to mention the ubiquity of social media. I mean, I have a hard enough time as a 53-year-old man trying to negotiate that. I can't imagine being 18-year-old or a 19-year-old and seeing how seemingly perfect the world is out there when we all know it is not, not all.
No, on Facebook,
all that
everything
way.
is perfect.
Correct. But listen, I want to thank Professor Smith, Stephen Smith. Thank you so much for coming on. He's a clinical associate professor emeritus at the School of Journalism and Mass Media at the University of Idaho in Moscow, not Moscow, Idaho. We get guests like this, powerhouses like this all the time. We have our Patreon page up and running now for those who enjoyed this podcast. Please check it out. It takes a lot of time, effort, and money to get these podcasts out there. We'd love for you to become a Patreon on Patreon. And Professor Smith, hoping that we get some developments very quickly. We find the killer, and when that happens, and it will, we'd like to have you back on to discuss how the case was solved.
I'll be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and to meet you both. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Joel, usually you ask, do you have anything to
Carmela
add?
has something that Carmela has a difficult time saying goodbye, but we'll analyze that at a different time. But is there anything we can plug for you, Professor? A website? No? He's retired.
You've done enough.
Ladies and gentlemen, he's retired. By the way, Colorado Springs, you're in our hearts. I get home last night, mass shooting at a Walmart. Look a little further down Twitter, a bombing that takes the life of a teenager in Toronto. The world has gone mad, but that's for another podcast. Love you, America.